Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hello and welcome to the April 26th edition of Basis Loaded with Joe Schmit. I am Joe Schmit, and this episode, as always, is produced by Paige Driscoll, and what we do here is break down the latest from the NDPSR report. Let's start this week with butter. This butter number coming in at 239.13 represents a plus 4 to the CME 1 week average of 234.95. Plus 4, higher than our expected 2 cent over positive basis, but that's what we've been running lately. Now that's with 16 loads traded on the CME last week. Volume on the NDPSR coming in a little bit over our expected 3.5 million pounds. So all in all, positive basis in butter on higher than expected volume. Moving on to cheese. Blocks, 190.82. That represents a plus 9 to the CME 1 week average of 181.44. And that's with 29 loads traded on the CME last week. So you may have noticed that I continue to use my 2-week lag for the average prices as the benchmark relative to this week's NDPSR report. I've started using last week's CME average volume or total volume as the sales on this report occurred last week. So with all that big volume traded on the CME last week and what is more and more becoming a larger percentage of the reported sales on this report, I thought it was important to change over to using last week's total volume, and this is something that will continue in the weeks to come. So 29 loads equates to 1.1 million pounds. That volume not reflected here on the NDPSR report. The NDPSR volume only coming in at 11,342, well short of our expected 12.5 million pounds. It's interesting to note that this is in the midst of our drop at the CME. The CME week to week moved down 15 cents, while here you'll notice on the NDPSR moving from last week to this week only losing 6.5 cents. So prices in the block proving sticky. 190.82 is likely higher than folks were expecting. So a higher than expected price in the blocks on lower than expected volume. In barrels, 174.05. That represents a plus 7 to the CME 2-week average of 166.85. And of course, last week we traded 85 loads on the CME. As far as CME volume goes, 85 loads is our third highest weekly volume total ever. And actually, if you combine the barrel volume with the block volume, you have a total of 114 loads traded at the CME, which is an all-time high, surpassing the June 4th, 2004 level of 112. So that's a number that has held up for almost 20 years. Sadly, I was here for the June 4th, 2004 week, trading dairy. Big volume at the CME. That 85 loads in barrel accounts to 3.5 million pounds. That extra volume is seen here, although not every bit of it, at the NDPSR. Our expected volume would be 13.5, this week surpassing 15 million pounds. So big volume on the NDPSR on a higher than expected basis, plus 7, well over our 4 to 6 expected higher basis. However, plus 7 on a substantial break. These numbers at the CME are getting into the NDPSR quicker with the help of 3.5 million loads being reported at CME minus, call it minus 3 or 4. And then next up, whey, 46.13. That's a nice number relative to the CME 1 week average of 41.88. That's a 4.5 cent positive basis. But of course, in whey, we are always looking at prior week's NDPSR. So the benchmark is this April 8th NDPSR number of 46.17. So last week at the CME, we had another big volume week, 35 loads. Trading at the CME, the average weekly price at the CME was $36.55. So if you want to say that when you subtract out the freight, that $36.55 becomes a 34 price, we had 1.4 million pounds traded at 34. And then if you go back to last week's benchmark, call it 3 million pounds traded at prior week's NDPSR plus 2. So 48. If you use that math, you still come up with around a 44 cent average. So this 46 cent NDPSR print that we're getting this week is a higher than expected price. A bump up from last week's NDPSR as whey at the CME has bottomed at this 35 level. It'll be interesting to see just how long it takes for the NDPSR to catch up with the spot trade at the CME. And then lastly, non-fat, 116.50. That's a plus 2 to the CME 1 week average of 114.38. That's with 7 loads traded on the CME last week. And our volume here on the NDPSR, a little bit short of our expected 20 million pounds, coming in at 19.1. But all in all, non-fat is the closest to the typical historical benchmarks that we like to use. As far as the other components of dairy, well, we're still kind of scrambling a little bit here at Basis Loaded, but what we ultimately come up with is, this is week 3 or 4 of the April pricing cycle, currently getting an April class 3 of 1862 with an April class 4 of 1812. So we've 50 cent class 3 over class 4, which is pretty close to our historicals. However, that's where the typical ends, because if you carry current CME equivalents out through the entirety of the May 4-week pricing cycle, currently getting a May class 3 of 1650, and then that class 4 jumps back over at 1815. So we still have a lot of trading yet to do at the CME. It was sure great seeing all of you during this recent ADPI week. On behalf of Paige and the Ever Ag Insights team, thanks so much. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.